According to the papers, the governor of Texas, John Connally, and his wife sat in front of the president. The driver looked toward the crowd. With a bewildered expression, Sherry mouthed Patch's name as she started forward under a red, white, and blue star-capped banner just beyond the traffic light. A policeman holding his white hat raced diagonally to block her path. The cop steered Sherry back into the crowd next to a black woman in a lightweight jacket. Patch again felt his heart thump as the limo moved ever so slightly forward. The depository sign flipped to 12:29 p.m. Kennedy progressed onto Houston Street, 7 minutes behind schedule. Somehow from inside the bubble, Patch had to slow or stop that limo. He drifted backward several dozen yards away from the traffic light. Behind Sherry, the advanced motorcycles began a curved trajectory from Main Street onto Houston Street. The people of Dallas smiled and turned toward the corner. Ahead, they lined both sides of the road like fans at a silent game. More than just citizens were on Elm Street. He spotted two men in fedora hats. Both men were familiar high-level intelligence operatives. A smattering of people, probably employees, had gathered on the front steps at the alcove of the depository. On the fourth floor, to the right, four women watched the parade from one of the open windows. Two dark-skinned men hovered in the corner fifth-floor window. As he stood in the middle of Houston Street, he looked left. Past the sign for the Stemmons Freeway, the crowd, some people with cameras, thinned out slightly in front of a sloping grass hill banking the concrete pergolas. Another road across the street paralleled Elm Street and inclined toward the concrete triple underpass. A group of men and a couple of cops stood on the tracks directly above Elm Street. The two lead motorcycles were now actually on Houston Street and gradually faced the depository building. Going through the front depository entrance would be difficult with the crowded doorway. Patch checked over his shoulder. The president's car was not far away down Main Street. He ran forward along the sandstone brick building. He passed between a few parade spectators and the frozen policemen in their blue and gold uniforms blocking Houston Street to the north. Patch had come to believe that Kennedy would be killed here in Dallas, but he never envisioned the wide range of people involved. The shadow of the depository darkened as he rounded the corner of the building a short time later. Out back, open bay doors perpendicular to each other lined the outside dock. The dock area itself was designated in white letters above. Texas School Book Depository Loading Dock. Patch leaped over the dimensional contours outlining the dock stairs and entered the building through an open metal door. Inside, the painted pipes and electrical cables formed a maze across the ceiling. He spotted an old staircase beyond stacks of cardboard boxes. Inside the narrow stairway, he started upstairs. Upon reaching the second floor, he paused to catch his breath. He leaned into the second floor, built with wallboard and a wood-grain door next to a floor safe. A motionless Lee Oswald sat in the booth seats on the right side with his hand wrapped around a glass Coke bottle. He wore a brown shirt with a unique jacket-like lapel collar open over his undershirt. Oswald read a newspaper as he sat at the table. For several seconds, with the motorcade coming up Main Street, Patch stared at the back of Oswald's neatly trimmed dark hair. From this area, Oswald could easily go to the first floor and watch the parade. Oswald! He walked around in front of the smaller man. Oswald! Oswald heard nothing as Patch's voice echoed in the bubble. How could Oswald shoot the president from down here? Had Patch changed something again by returning in time? He tried to shake Oswald's Coke, but all outside matter remained immovable and smooth. Patch glanced out the rear window. Then he moved past the safe into the stairs. He scrambled up the narrow stairs but turned again. Oswald had begun to lift up the folded newspaper. Patch then grabbed the dimensional edges of the metal pipe banister. On the 4th floor, he observed the 4 women watching the approaching motorcade in the 3rd pair of windows in the triple underpass side of the building. Anyone coming down those stairs from the upper floors would have been seen by these women, certainly if they descended the stairs after a shooting. He resumed the journey upward. On the 5th floor, 3 black men ate lunch at the windows. He twisted around and went up another floor. Inside the bubble, he crossed on the new plywood floor toward the window in the corner. He wondered if an assassin had slipped into the building with a floor-laying crew. A slew of boxes partially blocked the exact window above the 3 men on the lower floor. The elevators were stopped on the 5th floor. To his right, someone had wedged a rifle stamped 7.65 Mauser on the barrel between rows of open boxes in a single box. Was this the rifle that had disappeared back inside the window? He rounded the wall of boxes, and a second set of boxes propped to the lower brick casing of the window. One box rested on the brick sill and leaned against the second 2 boxes. Perhaps the same person had deposited a shell on the floorboard near the bottom box and against the painted bricks. Less than a foot away, a second shell lay identically in the floor crevice next to the bricks. The last shell was diagonally on the floor next to another cardboard box. Had this person thrown a crumpled lunch bag on the wood floor? Patch retreated along the book stacks next to the rear windows. In the lot behind the stockade fence, a white Impala passed a blue and white Oldsmobile station wagon and a black Ford with Texas plates. The man in the Ford had a phone or radio in the car. The driver of the Ford held the mobile unit in his hand. Red mud or dirt covered the paint up to the Impala's windows. The car left the lot. A man in a khaki uniform held a movie camera as he stood between the pergola and the stockade fence. Behind the fence, 3 men threw something into a red pickup truck. Then they headed for the rail yard. Patch scanned the people on the triple underpass, but caught sight of motorcycles turning near Elm Street. For some reason, to his right, 3 men climbed inside a railroad boxcar. Patch moved to the front of the 6th floor as the motorcade neared the corner. At the open window, he saw the light-colored Ford, the lead car, had turned onto Houston Street. Another cop held Sherry at the corner as the Ford passed. Patch retreated above the floorboards and back to the stairs. He thought about Oswald in the lunchroom. At each floor, he checked the windows. There were still men at the corner of the 5th floor window. His watch showed 1 p.m. in his diminished time, but the real time had to be approaching 12:30 p.m. He left the building at the docks. Once on Houston Street, he saw the dark blue presidential limousine, presidential seal flag imperceptibly flapping, had just angled its nose onto Houston Street from Main near Sherry. To his right, people looked out the windows and sat on the fire escape in the adjacent Dow Tex building. As he paused to slow down his breathing, he read the Hertz sign, 12:29 p.m. The lead motorcycles were already on Elm Street in the plaza, and the light-colored Ford with the 2 men inside began the turn onto Elm Street. He sprinted toward the approaching limousine and the Cadillac with agents behind. Mrs. Kennedy's pink hat, dark hair, and wide smile emerged in the brilliant light from behind the approaching limousine's American flag. Patch staggered forward. The president leaned toward his wife. In the shaded bubble, Patch stood no more than 6 feet away from the creeping limousine. He attempted to grab the car door only to encounter the smooth contours of the dimensional barrier. The limousine barrier actually bumped him ever so slightly. The bullets might do the same thing. He stepped away from the motorcycles behind the president's car, but he slipped and fell over. His hands and hips hit the street barrier as the motorcycles nearly hit him. In Tampa, the motorcycles were alongside the presidential limousine. He immediately got to his feet and ran by the president as the car aligned toward Elm Street. Some of the people in the depository had turned as the president's car approached. In the doorway crowd, a man who might have been Oswald, his shirt still open to his t-shirt, leaned forward on the left side of the school book depository entrance. A Ahead, a man in a plaid shirt rounded the depository side of the stockade fence. Still, Patch did not see anyone with a rifle in the upper windows of the depository. A shot from the depository right now with the approaching limo seemed an easy shot. Boxes remained in the sixth-floor window, but nothing more. Behind the fence, the plaid guy spoke with the man in a dark suit. Patch focused on President Kennedy, Jackie, the governor, and Mrs. Connolly. With no way to stop the limousine, he darted left. He ran by the pergola and onto the open grass. The crowd was sparse out here and on the base of the hill across the street. He stopped at the curb, diagonal to a lady in a red raincoat and a dark-haired woman in a gray coat. A young blonde-haired woman with a babushka scarf around her head raised a movie camera to film the motorcade. A cop followed the man in the plaid shirt behind the fence. The man in the dark suit had moved onto the tracks. He spoke to a railroad worker wearing coveralls and a hat as he stood in front of the switching box. As he said something, he retreated to the fence. The man bent over and then stood upright against the switching box. The president's car had swung onto Elm Street. No agent stood on the president's running boards. Strangely, two bright yellow marks on the concrete were neatly painted on each side of the curb across from the hill. More people in the crowd raised their arms to wave to the president. One by one, Patch panned the open windows of the surrounding buildings. People inside the depository doorway tracked the president's car proceeding imperceptibly along the sandstone building. The car moved in the autumn sunshine under a cluster of oak trees and toward a rectangular highway sign. President Kennedy smiled and waved. He had the most serene expression on his face. Patch thought he saw a black man in the corner of the window of the sixth floor of the book depository. White-helmeted motorcycle cops with their glass windshields and two red signal lights now traveled a distance behind the limousine. Even though the haze had cleared to a warming sunshine, a man in a sport coat opened a black umbrella into the air. A dark-skinned man in a light blue jersey and a dark beret waved at the president as the man with the umbrella continued his machinations. Half a dozen people ran across the grass to meet the president approaching in the Lincoln convertible. A spiraling gray swirl crossed the plaza and produced a spark on the asphalt near the president. As Patch turned to find the source, the linear path dissipated like the remains of a lighted fuse. From the top of the county records building at the corner of Houston and Main Streets, another thin straight line, like smoke spinning, moved steadily downward toward Kennedy. He stopped waving to the crowd. To his right, a little girl turned and stopped running. Kennedy looked puzzled. Patch observed the slow motion of the president's mouth. Even within the bubble's diminished motion, the president's head very rapidly moved from left to right. The president's body then slowly stiffened as the bullet entered below his right shoulder. Mrs. Kennedy began to lean toward President Kennedy. No one appeared to be shooting at the president from the corner sixth-floor window. A straight gray bullet trail emerged from the far left corner of the triple underpass. The spiraling laser-like trail pierced the windshield. The president's hands tightened. The governor, ever so slowly in real time, outside the shaded bubble, began to turn over his right shoulder. The president's hands moved upward toward his throat, and he lurched to the left. He had been hit through the Adam's apple. Glass chips from the windshield produced a slight shrapnel wound on Kennedy's face. Patch ran through the bubble along the Elm Street grass toward the motorcade. A man in a yellow shirt stood with his son. Behind him, a woman in a brown coat and kerchief held up her camera to film the president. Patch's eyes opened wide as another gray bullet trail rocketed out of the second floor of the Dow Tex building. Moving steadily, the bullet missed the car. The gray pipe-like smoke swirl past Patch on the grass and silently pinged the curb, scattering the concrete chips. A small residue of blood formed on the cheek of a dark-haired man standing below the center underpass. After the wounding of the president, from the western end of the depository's upper windows, a gray pipe bullet trail pushed downward toward the plaza. The governor's shoulder moved downward at a sharp angle, and his cheeks began to balloon out. From Patch's perspective, the shooting had lasted 20 or more seconds, but only a few seconds in real time. The trail to the depository window dissipated into nothingness. John Conley's cheeks were fully inflated, and his wife eventually pulled him to the other side of the car. The governor's face contorted into a pain-induced grimace. Patch tried to read his lips in a diminished motion, but he only understood a few words.
They'll kill us all.
In front of the pergola, across the street, a man in a dark suit and hat, steadied by a younger woman below, held a movie camera and tracked the motorcade atop one of the white concrete risers. The limousine driver turned around to check something, and inexplicably, the car stopped for a long time. The brake lights glowed red. The brunette woman in the dark gray coat aligned the camera with the president's car, but the president's body had slumped toward his wife. Conley's face tightened in excruciating pain in his wife's lap. Instantaneously from the tree clump, a flash lingered like a warning lantern in the night, and a ring of smoke slowly materialized at the stockade fence. Workers atop the triple underpass had turned slightly. The man in the suit bent over the fence as the skinny railroad man with glasses and a thin mustache slowly pointed toward the first flash. A bullet trail from the little hill tore into the grass near the woman with the camera and another woman in a red coat. A hatless policeman wearing shooter's glasses slowly retracted a rifle on the hill. His badge glistened briefly. The young army man filming near the stockade fence dropped to the ground as if he were in combat. At the left side of the triple underpass, a flash and smoke preceded the spinning gray path of the bullet. The president's driver, instead of leaving the plaza, turned again for several seconds. The gray trail connected directly to a newly formed dark opening, scattering the hair above President Kennedy's forehead above the right eye, and exited out the rear of his skull. As Jackie held him, Kennedy moved slightly forward, his hand near his throat, his auburn hair profile heightened in the sunlight. At the left side of the underpass, a slow mass of gun smoke drifted into the front of the plaza. The president's body, as if pushed by a giant, had barreled forward. A bullet had entered his head just above the right ear. Kennedy's skull exploded so violently, brain matter and spray cascaded outward and upward maybe 4 feet high. The bullet exited and formed a wound about the size of a baseball in the right anterior of his head. A sizable chunk of the president's skull bone tumbled over the limo's trunk, and half his brain was exposed down to the pink cerebellum. The lasting impact flung the president's body backward. Fleshy matter and blood now covered the motorcycle windshield. Patch was horrified by the gaping, fleshy hole in the trim brown hair in the rear of the president's head. A piece of the skull and hair slowly rolled across the trunk as the car seemingly stopped. From the upper depository window, a gray trail extended rapidly toward the car, hitting the governor in the wrist and thigh. A car full of Secret Service agents remained at a maintained distance. Only one of the agents ran forward from the car. Another agent started out of the car, only to be called back by another man. Inside the Cadillac, an agent lifted an automatic weapon into the air. A middle-aged man with long dark hair and an open white shirt and khaki pants ran adeptly toward the cars along the railroad side. In his hand was a transceiver. On the hill, a policeman kicked the army man with his camera in the buttocks. The man yelled up at him, and the policeman waved a shotgun outside the bubble. Then the man slowly removed the film canister from his camera and threw it at the policeman. Mrs. Kennedy inched on her knees over the limousine trunk. A security man in a dark suit from the car behind ran ponderously slow in diminished time toward the limousine. Patch turned away from the brain-exposed hole in the back of the president's head. The security man caught the car and pushed Mrs. Kennedy back up inside. He turned and gave a thumbs-down gesture to the car full of agents. The man in the dark suit atop the hill turned toward the tracks. Patch climbed the hill toward the stockade fence and rounded the side pergola. He saw a policeman without a hat near the stockade fence. But along the inside of the wood fence, the man in the suit scrambled away with a rifle securely against his chest. He neared a metal extension or pipe that followed down the railroad tracks. Waiting was the man in the gray railroad coveralls and hat. The man in the suit precisely lofted the rifle through the air and over the extended pipe. The railroad worker clamped his hands around the weapon as he caught it. Chasing these men from inside the bubble would be fruitless. On the triple underpass, the railroad worker tensed and then compacted his body so he was kneeling behind a railroad switching box. In well-defined movements gained from experience, this man neatly detached specific components of the rifle. A soft railroad brakeman's bag lay on the railroad bed. One by one, the worker neatly slid each part of the rifle into the bag. Then he walked nonchalantly north up the railroad track. The president's car blended into the darkness under the triple overpass. The agent with the automatic weapon remained standing as the follow-up car too disappeared below the underpass. The men who had watched from the top of the underpass descended upon the parking lot as a multitude of people converged in slow motion up the hill. Yet the man who had waved the umbrella sat casually on the curb with the man in the blue shirt. He watched the mass of people rush up the hill as the man in the beret spoke into a walkie-talkie with a long antenna. The man in the dark suit had just returned to the fence area behind the plaza. A Dallas policeman, his revolver drawn, had run up the hill and confronted him with his handgun. The man in the suit showed his empty hands and pulled out some kind of identification. Bernard Barker, dressed casually in a light shirt, stood next to him. He also thrust out his identification to the police officer. The cop put his gun back in the holster and the man in the suit merged with the crowd from the plaza. A white helmeted policeman rushed up the hill toward the corner of the bridge and scanned ahead. Under the bridge, near where the curb had been hit by a bullet, a dark-haired man touched the blood on his cheek. As he stood across the street, the man with the beret had some type of device strapped to the small of his back. He walked unconcerned down the sidewalk in the direction of the triple underpass. Back up Elm Street, police motorcycles and cars were angled at the depository entrance and people went in and out. For a second, Patch thought he saw Oswald on the top of the depository steps, holding something in his hand as if he were praying, but he wasn't sure. A helmeted policeman dropped his motorcycle and stampeded diagonally through the disoriented crowd toward the steps. Then he disappeared inside the building. A man that could have been Oswald moved between the mailbox and a group of police gathered below the steps. Back in the center of the plaza, most of the parade spectators began to run up the hill toward the stockade fence. Patch put his head in his hands and backed off as a huge locomotive moved down the tracks. As he wandered back to the stockade fence, he draped his arms over the dimensional barrier around the picket fence and hung his head. The limousine emerged onto the freeway. The man with blood drizzling down his face looked confused near the curb down below the underpass. A mother and father covered their two children on the ground while a photographer took pictures. Patch slowly shook his head as the gruesome scene, now chaotic with darting people and traffic, would not leave his thoughts. Most people in the plaza had run up the grass hill. It was as if he were not just inside the bubble, but within a horrific nightmare. A wide, dissipating glob of smoke drifted into the plaza from the hill with the stockade fence. A helmeted policeman left his motorcycle at the curb and started up the underpass hill. Patch fell to the ground and propped his elbows below his knees and hung his head. Those to whom he had trusted to stop this murder had allowed it to take place. He cried within the bubble. When he finally looked up, he thought he saw Oswald in a t-shirt run down the hill toward Elm Street. He jumped into a light-colored Nash Rambler station wagon, pulled over to the curb. In the slow-moving retrograde traffic, a Cadillac almost hit the Rambler. As the station wagon slowly drove away, Patch got to his feet. Within the confusion of the crowd, he moved back along Elm Street. As he started down Houston Street, Jim Braden, in a topcoat and snap-brim hat, exited from the brick building behind the depository. Braden carried an oversized briefcase and crossed the street out of sight. Patch stumbled onto the sidewalk and held the edge of the building. His shadow formed darker. The chaos returned to the entire plaza with a sound at first and then fresh air. He heard loud wailing and crying as he turned. Sherry was not at the corner. A herd of people had rumbled up the hill toward the stockade fence. His watch read 1:30 p.m., but only 15 minutes had passed on the Hertz sign atop the depository. Sherry ran down the sidewalk from the depository screaming his name. "Patch! They shot the president!" She threw her arms around Patch and he looked into her teary eyes. "I saw it. I saw it all. You just faded away." He hugged her tightly. "I really thought I was going to stop him from being shot. I don't understand any of this." "And Braden, he came out of the Daltex building," he said, pointing at the building perpendicular to the depository, "carrying a case. He was in on this." Sherry helped him to his feet. "Where's Oswald?" "Pretty sure I saw him get into a station wagon on Elm Street." "Oswald must have killed the president." Pat shook his head. "No, he didn't. There were 6 to 8 shots." "How do you know this? I heard 3, maybe 4. Oswald is up to his eyeballs in this, but he was at a booth in the lunchroom. Somebody stashed a gun and shells upstairs before this even happened. There must be fingerprints all over those boxes up there." He looked up at her and held her shoulders. "And I called the FBI, Sherry." And Pilatus wrote to J. Edgar Hoover. Patch wiped his eyes. His stomach churned as if he had a sudden onslaught of the flu. His hand shook. The radio on the motorcycle across the street erupted with a report. "What is thought to be a .30 caliber rifle. Attention all squads. The suspect from Elm in Houston is reported to be an unknown white male about 30, slender build, 5 foot 10 inches tall, 165 pounds, armed with what is thought to be a .30 rifle. No further description is available at this time or information." "Where did they get that information?" asked Patch, thinking back to what he had just observed. A man with a large ring went to speak with a lanky man with short dark hair. That man, I've met him before. The radio dispatch disrupted his thoughts. "Attention all squads. The suspect in the shooting at Elm in Houston. Suspect is to be an unknown white male, approximately 30, 165 pounds, slender build, armed with what is thought to be a .30 rifle. Repeat, unknown white male, 30, 165 pounds, slender build. No further description at this time or information." Across the street, 3 men marched with armed blue uniformed police officers along the depository building. Yet both cops had their rifles casually resting on their forearms. 2 of the men wore unkempt sport coats and wrinkled pants. The third guy wore a jacket and a hat and stained light pants. Patch took a step forward as a man he recognized walked along the delivery gate in the opposite direction. "That man is a general, a high-ranking general." "What man?" she asked. He disappeared along the building. He scanned the 3 men again. The forward cop had a communications device embedded in his ear. Very strange. But Patch could not get the image of Kennedy's head exploding out of his mind. She put her hand on his cheek. "Maybe Kennedy's okay." "It blew a hole in his head, Sherry."